he thought it was interesting to look at just the status messages and see what get at a glance kind of the real sense of what your coworkers are up to at that point in time. And he had a very rich history in that he wrote dispatch software for many years for ambulances, taxis, and couriers. So he was fascinated with this whole world of sort of knowing the map of where everyone was in the city and what they were up to, and so he was fascinated by that, and it was kind of a perfect match because Evan and I had been doing the social media stuff for 10 years, or 10 years now, but by then, I don't know, when was that, 2006 or so, about 6 or 7 years we've been sort of toiling away in blogging and communities and things like that, and so when we started talking about it together, it just sounded really compelling and interesting, and much more interesting than what we were doing with Odeo, unfortunately. But what we did was we built a prototype, and we asked everyone who was working at Odeo to try it out and let us know if it was too weird, if it was too simple, and because we were afraid that it was maybe too conceptual. This idea that you would tell a service what you were doing, and then the service would then tell the people who cared about what you're doing that little message, and then we would see what happens. And what happened was I went home over the weekend and I tried it out, and my first experience with it was great because I feel like I had several first experiences with it, but one of my first was that we had just bought this house in Berkeley, and I was tearing up all the flooring of the previous owners because it was really gross, and there was like all kinds of weird stuff underneath the rug that I don't want to talk about. I was sweating. It was really hot. It was like the 2 weeks in the Bay Area where it gets unbearably hot, and the rest of the time it's beautiful. And I chose those 2 weeks to tear up the carpet. And I was like, oh, this job sucks. My back hurts. I'm sweating. And my phone buzzed in my pocket, and I looked down, and it was Evan, and he said, sipping Pinot Noir after a massage in Sonoma. And I was just like, oh my God. And I started laughing just like you guys just did. And I was thinking to myself, this thing's making me laugh. We got something here. And then I went back. Everyone had had similar experiences, so we knew that our little prototype was going to be cool, at least for those of us who were working there. And then later on, it began to show itself as really useful, especially during urgent shared events. And like you mentioned, the conference at South by Southwest in 2007 was an early indicator that this service, which hadn't really existed before, and we hadn't really thought about creating a new way to communicate per se. We were originally just thinking a simple way, a rudimentary sort of social networking type of tool. But when we saw people using it at South by Southwest, we were alerted to a new behavior, and that was what I like to describe as akin to a flock of birds moving around an object in flight. They seem so choreographed, so beautiful, so arranged, but it's really very simple, rudimentary behavior, real-time interaction between individuals, each of them just responding to those around them, which results in an aggregate behavior of sort of an emergent behavior of them moving beautifully together. And so at this conference in 2007, we were seeing things like, we were seeing people, suddenly people if you were in the hallway, you would suddenly see a whole group of people move from one doorway to the next, like, what just happened? Where are they all going? And it was because they were on Twitter, and they were saying, this speaker's kind of boring. But we're hearing that this other guy in the other room was killing it. And so people were like, what? And they were moving as one suddenly over to here. And then South by Southwest, as much as the panels are interesting, it's really all about the parties and hanging out and drinking and everything with everybody that you're supposed to hang out with in San Francisco, but you never do. So you hang out in Austin once a year, like a family reunion. Anyways, there was this one guy he had a pretty good following on Twitter. And we had enough people on Twitter by 2007, even though it was prototyped in 2006. We had just enough of the dorks and geeks on it at South by Southwest. I don't know if everyone knows about South by Southwest, but most people think of it as a music conference, a big music festival, but they don't realize that, like these nerdy people come in first and kind of do their thing, and you can actually see like the nerds leaving as the cool guys with the leather jackets and guitars like check in, and everyone else is leaving. But what happened was there was this one guy, and he said, this pub is too crowded, we can't talk, we're not having a good time, let's move over to this other pub on 6th Street, and he named the pub, and in the 10 minutes it took him to walk over there, it was completely jam-packed. And so his plan totally backfired, but what it illustrated was that I think he had like 100 followers or something like that, and because so many of them were at South by Southwest, there was a good half of them that were there, and those 50 people then twittered the same message, like, hey, Scott says we're going to this other place, and they send it out to each of their followers, so you can do the math exponentially, and you end up with like 850 people showing up at a little tiny pub in 6th Street, and they're like, what the hell? But that's just for fun and social and in a pub. But then you started to see situations around the world where people were responding to emergencies like earthquakes or wildfires, or last year I think it was, there was a gas shortage in Atlanta, and people were using Twitter to help each other find where the fuel could be found, and they were using Twitter search and the hashtags and the things that they had. And I'll talk a little bit about all the things that users have invented on Twitter. They were using the service to help each other coordinate and move to where they had the fuel, and that's when it's during those times, like the earthquakes, the fuel shortage, and this Moldovan revolt that was partially organized over Twitter. That was a good one. I got into work the next day, and I got all these calls from like the BBC and New York Times. What's your role in this Moldovan revolt? Like, what are you talking about? I masterminded the whole thing, as a matter of fact, if you really want to know. Yeah, and so that was when a friend of mine, actually, we were having lunch, and he's worked in the Valley forever, and he asked me the question, what do you hope that people will think or say about Twitter 5 or 10 years out? And it was all these stories kind of swirling in my head that made me think that I hope that they ultimately think that it's not about the triumph of technology, it's about the triumph of humanity. And that made me think that's really true for all of these things. All of these social kind of experiments is what I like to think of them as, because I don't think anything's figured out yet. And I think all these great services, these social networks and everything, what they're doing is we're just iterating and experimenting and trying things out, and we're seeing what sticks and seeing what works, and trying to bring a little bit more nuance and sophistication. Oh, thank you, my glass of vodka. I need this. The hair of the dog from last night. I think we're trying to bring a little bit of nuance and sophistication into our electronic conversations and discussions and interactions, like we have in person. The little doubtful eye movement or whatever. And so people will joke about giving someone else a poke on Facebook or something like that. And certainly there may be apps that aren't going to have staying power, and but I think all of them are really interesting for the fact that we're experimenting, we're trying to find new ways to communicate. And Twitter's really interesting because we've always had this kind of device agnostic mentality about it, where we kept the messages really short to be under the limit of international SMS, so that the message could always be read in its entirety, whether it was on a rudimentary phone in Nokia in the Sudan, or a really fancy web connection in Manhattan on TweetDeck or one of these fancy API projects. And so one of the things that's really inspiring to me as we go forward with Twitter is this idea that that we can bring the power of this real-time network to the weakest of signals around the world through the rudimentary technology of SMS, because every one of the 4 billion mobile phone customers are all Twitter ready. They all have SMS on their phones, and you don't have to create a Twitter account on the web in order to create an account. You can just start following someone over SMS or send a message to Twitter over SMS, and an account will be created for you. And the kind of things that we're seeing, so that's really interesting, because that's 4 billion mobile phones, and there's 1.5 billion people on the web, and when you add that to the mix and you say, okay, we're gonna network all of these things together through Twitter, both the web connections and the phones, and then we're gonna continue to nourish this ecosystem and a platform and open it so people can develop on this new network that combines existing networks, and what will happen and what will be created. And again, it'll be, I think, a triumph of humanity, because people will come up with some amazing stuff. And more recently, lump into that one of the most ubiquitous communication devices on Earth, which is television, and some of the experiments we're starting to do there, early ones with current TV, in making television more interactive.